Great. Well, today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Will Simonson. Will leads the agroforestry research area at the Organic Research Centre, where he coordinates research and development work on farming with trees. His studies and career have been shaped by an interest in the science and policy of achieving climate change resilience, food security, and biodiversity conservation in agricultural landscapes. He's worked at the University of Cambridge's Global Food Security Initiative, the Climate Change and Biodiversity Programme of the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, as well as 12 years working at the Christian environmental organisation Arosha, based at its field centre in Portugal. So this makes him incredibly well placed to turn our eyes towards trees today as we explore how we can view trees as teachers in modern landscapes and also throughout biblical history. So over to you, Will. Thank you.
In this talk, The Trees Are Teachers, I'm going to take quite a personal perspective. So drawing on my career and the science that's been part of that, but also my faith journey as well, and the two being held together to the best of my ability over the years. And so I hope that will be a helpful approach to you as you listen to me talk about this subject. And I think for me, it feels very much in line with the valuable work that the Faraday Institute does. This slide summarizes what I'm hoping to cover this afternoon. I can trace a line from today back to the late 1980s when I first started thinking more deeply about matters of faith and science, when I was reading natural sciences here in Cambridge. And at that time, I coordinated a group called the Christian Biologists, which was a faculty group of the Christian Union at the university, KICU. And we explored issues such as creation and evolution, genetic technologies, the environmental crisis. And it's through that group that I also first learned about the work of Arosha, Christians in Conservation. Peter Harris, the founder, came to Cambridge and talked about that work. We met at the Henry Martin Hall, and my eyes were opened to this very extraordinary type of mission, and it became part of my life for considerable time, and indeed part of Rachel's and my family's too, as we served together in Portugal for the Arosha Portugal project. An ardent supporter of the work of Arosha was the late Reverend Dr. John Stott, the Anglican minister, theologian and writer, who throughout his life had a passion for birdwatching. With a worldwide ministry, his travel bag would never be missing a pair of binoculars or a telescope. And in the course of his travels, I believe he saw or identified about 2,500 species of bird of the 9,000 or so that exist in the world. He took very literally the command of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, "Look at the birds of the air," which he noted means from the original Greek, not just notice, but fix your eyes upon, take a good look at. He took it literally enough to go on to write a book advocating that we all do just that. Birds have lessons to teach us, he claimed. The feeding of ravens, a lesson in faith. The value of sparrows, a lesson in self-esteem. The soaring of eagles, a lesson in freedom, and so on. If the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who delight in them, as we read in Psalm 111, and if those works refer to his works of creation as well as redemption, then nature study and Bible study can be fruitfully pursued together. And his book on what he termed ornithology was called The Birds Are Teachers. And of course, you will have noticed that I borrowed the formula of that title for today's. Trees are wonderful. I doubt whether there's much dispute about that. They provide essential resources for our livelihoods, and they create beauty in the world. They are celebrated in contemporary natural history writing, books such as The Arbonaut, A Life Discovering the Eighth Continent in the Trees Above Us by Meg Lomond, or The Songs of Trees, Stories from Nature's Great Connectors by David George Haskell, The Magic of Trees by Olavi Huakari, The Wisdom of Trees by Max Adams. The Heartbeat of Trees, Embracing Our Ancient Bond with Forests and Nature by Peter Vollenbun. Vollenbun is also the author of the classic The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from the Secret World. And this is a favorite of mine and others I know. And the book describes many things about trees, including, for example, about the symbiotic relationships that trees have with mycorrhizal fungi, which tap into their roots and create these amazing networks of hyphae that connect those trees together so that they can communicate and share food resources, the so-called forest internet or the wood wide web. In the book's introduction, Vollenbun invites his reader to share his joy of trees. He recalls what trees had taught him, his thesis being that our appreciation of trees affects the way that we interact with the world around us. But as well as popular interest, in response to the current nature and climate crises, the planting and maintaining of trees in our landscapes have received ever-increasing policy support. Every 2 years, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN produces an authoritative, extensively researched update on the state of the world's trees. Deforestation, as we know, has been a massive problem over many, many years. But the 2024 edition does offer some rays of hope in the bleak picture. There has been a significant reduction in deforestation in some countries, for example, by 8.5% in Indonesia recently, by 50% in Brazil's Amazonian region. And yet climate change is making forests ever more vulnerable to stresses such as wildfire, and prevalence of pests. Harvesting of timber and forest products throughout the world is enormous. 6 billion people use non-timber forest products. Directly or indirectly, we exert an immense amount of pressure on the world's forest resource. Forests are reducing in their size, in their condition, and forest tree species are disappearing. An alarming headline from just a couple of weeks ago from a study by Botanic Gardens Conservation International, Basic Kew Gardens, is that over 1/3 of tree species are at risk of extinction. The UK is one of the least wooded countries of the world. We have lost many of our trees, but there are now ambitious targets to restore that cover. For England, the 25-year environment plan was published by the government in 2018 with the stated aim to improve the environment within a generation. It included the target to increase woodland in England towards the aspiration of 12% cover by 2060. And as a step on the way towards that target, to plant 180,000 hectares by the end of 2042. The Environment Improvement Plan, which was a 5-year update on that original plan, hence published in 2023, provides more definition on the actions required to deliver the plan's goals. This includes promoting the planting of trees on farmland through subsidy options that are part of the new post-Brexit environmental land management schemes. So the planting of trees is considered a tool to combat both the loss of biodiversity and address the climate change challenge, helping not only to mitigate climate change, but also to adapt to its effects and to build resilience. Based on research by Cranfield University, the Woodland Trust produced a couple of years ago their own policy agenda recommending that trees be integrated into 10% of arable farming and 30% of livestock farming. And so, for example, the latter would result in net zero emissions from the grassland sector by 2050. These actions, bringing trees into Britain's farmland, is collectively known as agroforestry, which has been the focus of my own work over the last 4 years and a big part of my career before that as well. So I'd like to say a little bit more about what that is and what this land management approach involves. So simply put, agroforestry is about farming with trees, and it's further defined as the practice of deliberately integrating woody vegetation, whether trees or shrubs, with crops and/or animal systems to benefit from the ecological and economic interactions. So ecological in terms of, for example, conserving the soils and improving their fertility, increasing rainfall infiltration, shading and sheltering crops from some weather extremes, and animals from the effects of heat or wind, and therefore improving their health and well-being, and providing more naturalistic settings that allow them to exert their natural behaviors as well. Not to mention the nutritional, medicinal properties of the tree browse. So there's the ecological benefits, but then there's also the economic benefits that can be in supporting more production and diversifying the products that the farmer can sell, produce from the trees as well as from the field crops or the livestock. So different types of agroforestry are recognized. There's the silver arable, trees with arable, silver pasture, silver horticulture, even silver poultry, etc. So different types exist. And whilst there's been much focus recently on this so-called alley cropping arrangement, as shown in this diagram, in other words, lines of trees that are crossing the field that allow the other farming activities to happen in between those tree lines, some also recognize the importance of boundary agroforestry. So in other words, your hedgerows and your shelter belts and your riparian woodlands. And so one starts to see that actually the agroforestry can embrace much of what we value about trees in today's farmscapes, if managed in that intentional, integrated way. In many ways, the concept of agroforestry is more established internationally. In my previous work for the organization that was such a mouthful, well done, Cara, I had the opportunity to work with the World Agroforestry Center, and on one occasion visited Brazil, attending the conference of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. And just outside the city of Curitiba, there's the Brazil's government's agricultural research agency, Embrapa, have an experimental farm with some agroforestry. So some lines of eucalyptus trees within which they have a rotation of grazing and cropping. And I was really struck by one phenomenon, one example, which really brought home to me how important this kind of integration can be, which is that in one particularly hot and drought-prone year, the maize that was growing out in the open fields perished. It failed to produce any kind of crop, whilst that was growing in between the tree rows completed its life cycle and produced a really reasonable harvest. In the UK, novel expressions of agroforestry are relatively new, to the extent that this example in Suffolk, this is Wakelin's agroforestry, planted in the early 1990s, is considered truly pioneering. And the Organic Research Centre has had a long association with this site, and it's one that I've grown to love as I've done some research over recent years. And as one of the few agroforestry farms that are really mature in this country, it has unparalleled research and demonstration potential with a wide range of different formations of trees and crops to be seen. So fields with fruit, with apples and other fruit trees, other fields with densely planted willows and hazel, which are coppice for biomass production for making wood chip, yet others with a mix of timber trees. And then there's a rotation of organic cereals and vegetables in between. And it's also a great example of that principle of diversification with what the manager David Wolf calls enterprise stacking within this one quite small space. It's only 22 hectares. And so there's a bakery and food business, there's community-supported agriculture, there's a grazier who brings her flock of sheep, there's a craft business and a hemp business, and there's ecotourism, all happening within that one space. And importantly, bringing back labour back into the countryside in that way. So here's another example. This is Whitewall Farm in North Cambridgeshire, so not very far away from us. And it's managed by Stephen Briggs, a first-generation farmer and tenant of this council-owned farmland. And some 20 years or so ago, driven by observing how soil was just literally blowing off his fields in that exposed fenland setting, he decided to plant some lines of trees. These lines are about 24 meters apart, so his modern agricultural machinery still is able to pass in between. And as those trees have matured, it's ameliorated those winds, the erosion of the soils has been reduced. But as a strong advocate of agroforestry, Stephen also speaks about the more efficient harvesting of sunlight that can be achieved through this kind of three-dimensional farming. And that can lead to a greater output per land area than would be achieved by growing those trees or those field crops in monocultures. And that sometimes it's possible to calculate that or to estimate it using a value called the land equivalent ratio. So for example, at Whitehall Farm, it's about 1.4, meaning that if you were to separate the trees and crops, you would need basically 1.4 more greater area of land to produce the same production. This is somewhere I visited a few weeks ago in Shropshire, and it's run by somebody called Peter Aspin. So he's been experimenting with silver pasture for over 20 years. And his driving kind of motivation, if you like, was to provide a better microclimate for the livestock in his fields. So lowering those maximum temperatures in the summer, raising those minimum temperatures in the winter. And he's also been observing how those lines of trees are actually really helping to improve the rainfall, infiltration to the soil, prevent that runoff and the kind of flooding, localized flooding that can happen in his fields as well. So there's a lot going on in that system as well. And then here is an example of a silver horticultural agroforestry in Gloucestershire. And this is the vision of somebody called Andy Dibben, the head grower at Abbey Home Farm. So across his 6-hectare area of vegetable growing, he's planted lines of trees with multiple purposes. So certainly including fruit for the farm shop, but also to enhance agriculturally important and useful biodiversity. By that I mean pollinators. So he's planted trees that provide pollen over as long a period of time as possible. So right from January with the catkins of hazels through early flowering willow and alder, and then cherry and apples and pears, right through to elders and spindles at the end of the season. So it's that kind of pollination resources. There's also the habitat for the natural predators of the common pests, which obviously he's wanting to control for his vegetable crops. So it's encouraging the blue tits to feed on the caterpillars, the ground beetles to feed on the slugs, the bats that feed on the moths, and the insects such as lacewings, hoverflies, and parasitic wasps that feed on the aphids. A review of 45 studies across Europe by somebody called Florian Petty in France and his co-workers. This was published last year, and this really corroborates that approach of encouraging the local farm biodiversity. And that's shown in the summary infographic on the left-hand side here, where each number represents a different peer-reviewed study. You can see that the impact of planting trees in farmland on different aspects of biodiversity is very often positive, but not unequivocally so. And so you can also see that there are some negative interactions there. And so I think it's important to observe that just the design and management of agroforestry that is really important and comes into play and affects the impact that it will have on different groups of species. And as another example, I've been recently involved in some research as part of a European Horizon project, looking at the biodiversity and of bats, which has been little studied in these systems. And we were finding that planting trees in pasture lands really has a dramatic effect in increasing the diversity and numbers of bats to be found on those farms. But that effect isn't so visible within the arable situation. And so what we're speculating here, and more research is needed, that is the interaction of the trees with the livestock and the dunging and the supporting of the insects from that livestock, which together is creating a much more healthy ecosystem for the bats. Another strand of my recent work has been holding workshops with farmers. So agroforestry is a relatively knowledge-intensive practice. Farmers ain't foresters, as one farmer put it. So we've been wanting to understand what some of the barriers are to them adopting such practices, particularly the knowledge needs they have now and how best that those can be met. And in one project that I'm involved in at the moment, we're working with the Woodland Trust and the National Trust, we're taking cohorts of farmers through different routes of learning about agroforestry, then comparing how they get on and how they develop the confidence and knowledge necessary to give it a go from themselves. And this work is being funded by DEFRA, the Environment Agency, as part of the co-design process for those new schemes I mentioned earlier, the environmental land management schemes that are being put into place. And so just this year, for example, there's some new grant options are being launched for farmers to be able to plant trees. So there's some capital grants for tree planting, but also a maintenance grants to actually look after those trees once they're in the ground. And that, of course, is incredibly important. But whilst all of this is being rolled out as a climate smart farming innovation, as already alluded to, it's really a case of returning to what we once had, to the treed farmscapes that were once commonplace in Britain and abroad. The late Professor Ola Rackham, for many years an authority in historical ecology and the interpretation of the countryside, wrote extensively about the wood pastures, which is an example of agroforestry, and which were once common. It can still be seen in places like Burnham Beeches and Epping Forest. And one of the practices that would have been quite common in these wood pastures is pannage, in which the pigs were fattened on the acorn mast of the oak trees in the system. And key to managing these wooded pastures was keeping the animals away from the tree regrowth, and so you would have the pollarding shown by that little diagram. A comparable system is the Montados of Portugal and the Dehesas of Spain. So these savanna-like systems are characterized by the sparsity of their trees within a matrix of open fields and shrubland vegetation. And they're a natural and, in a sense, cultural artifact. So not actually ancient. The ones we see today are perhaps only 250 years old, but they're analogous to natural savannas that pollen evidence tells us were prevalent in Iberia from about 2500 BC. So the trees are commonly cork oak trees and home oak trees, and these provide habitat for a whole community of insects and birds and other animals, and they prevent soil erosion and maintain soil fertility and moisture. And with the trees managed, with the area between the trees managed as pasture or low intensive arable, you get an outstanding flora as well. And one study I've seen, they were finding something like 135 different species of herbaceous plant and grass within a tenth of a hectare, which is quite an outstanding level of plant diversity to be found in Europe. But the Montado and the Dehesa also support a remarkably persistent mixed farming and herding economy. So Russell Smith in 1916, writing in the Geographic Review, wrote, "If I wanted to be comfortably and permanently rich, I could ask for few more secure bases for it in the line of agricultural lands than the undisturbed possession of a few hundred acres of Portuguese land with a good stand of cork oak trees and evergreen oak trees, with its yield of cork and pork." So, of course, the pork coming from the acorns once again. So going back a little bit, perhaps further in history, another example of agroforestry practice, and this is from the 10th century AD in southern Spain. It's from the Arab occupation, which brought the agroforestry technology that can be seen around the township of Elche. So the palm gardens surrounding the urban core of that town survived the Christian conquest in the 13th century and continued in use for many, many years until their gradual deterioration in the 20th century due to urban expansion and the modernization of agriculture. So these palm gardens were a marvelous demonstration of a tree helping to create an oasis out of a near desert. At its heart was a canal network feeding an area where date palms are planted in a grid pattern along those water channels, and thus delimiting the individual plots in which were grown forage crops, cereals such as wheat, barley, alfalfa, and medium-sized trees such as pomegranate, which appears to be the case in this rare aerial image from the local archives. And as well as the dates for human animal consumption, the palm trees had other economic uses, fiber production, trunks for the construction of the traditional style of houses in the region, as well as religious use, the palma blanca or white palm, the bleached fronds used for Palm Sunday procession at Easter. But beyond these economic and religious values, palms have an essential role in improving, again, the soils reducing evapotranspiration, producing the more humid microclimate upon which the other crops depend. We can trace agroforestry back further to the Near East of biblical times. The book of Numbers in the Old Testament describes the wandering of the Jews in the wilderness after the exodus from Egypt and before their final delayed arrival in the promised land of Canaan. And halfway through the book, the Lord instructs Moses to send out scouts to that land. And they went first to the southern steppe land and then on to the central highland ridge. And Moses' instructions were to see what the land was like, whether people who lived there were strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land did they live in? Was it good or bad? What kind of towns did they live in, whether fortified or not? How was the soil? Was it fertile or poor? And were there trees in it or not? And also to bring back some of the fruit of the land. And we're told that the scouts brought back a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large that it had to be carried on a pole between them. And they also brought back pomegranates and figs. In the book of Deuteronomy, this promised land is described as a good land, a land with brooks and streams and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat, barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and where they were to lack nothing. And so such references give rise to the plant set, the so-called 7 species that were the foundation of the agriculture in those biblical times: the wheat and barley and vines, and then the 4 trees, the olives, the figs, pomegranates, and finally the date palms, reference to honey being the sugary liquid made from those dates. E. Soloway of the Arava Institute of Environmental Studies describes how, because there was little chance of procuring food from outside, the biblical era sustainable agriculture was extremely conservative, concentrating on reliable crops that were able to produce with sparse and sometimes irregular supplies of water and other inputs. And these crops are also protective and generative of soil and many useful products that we use to feed both people and animals. And they contributed mulch and thatch for the roofs, and timber and wood for the plows and tools, dyestuffs, sugar, and coarse fibers as well. So these were almost certainly agroforestry landscapes. And Julian Evans, the former professor of forestry at Imperial College, in his book, God's Trees, imagines those farmscapes from his own contemporary expeditions. And this photograph that we've been looking at of well-tended olive groves, distant vineyards, trees, and woodland in a prosperous and fertile countryside is perhaps not unlike in those biblical times. Given the agrarian character of society in biblical times, it's no surprise that to find a prominent place of trees have in the Bible, in its laws, its stories, and its teachings. If the entire Bible is summarized in the key narratives of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, a tree has a prominent place in each one. The Lord God making all kinds of tree grow out of the ground in the creation account, the forbidden fruit of the apple tree being consumed in the account of the fall, Jesus lifted on a tree in that act of salvation, which is so central to every Christian life, and the tree of life growing on both sides of the river of life in the New Jerusalem, described in Revelation, yielding fruit in every month. As we know, Jesus used trees for his parables, such as the fig tree, to describe his second coming, whilst the short tax collector Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore fig to be able to see him. The Apostle Paul uses an olive tree to explain salvation and the people of God, the practice of grafting branches into olive trees as an illustration on how both Jew and Gentile, separate people for millennia, come together now as one in Christ. Genesis 2:9 says, "The Lord God made all kinds of tree grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food." I was at Brno in May this last year for the European Agroforestry Federation conference, and it was opened by somebody called Patrick Worms, who's the Senior Science Policy Advisor at the World Agroforestry Centre. And he summarized, as I've tried to do, some of the many benefits of agroforestry, whether for climate, diversification, biodiversity, soil conservation, But he went on to say that how many times he would speak to a farmer who, whilst recognizing all of that kind of benefit for sure, would actually tell him that ultimately what they took most satisfaction from was having created a field, a corner of their farm, which is beautiful, which gives them pleasure. Was another farmer who has planted trees and shrubs across some fields in an estate in Oxfordshire put it, compared to looking at a prairie of wheat, it's amazing. It gladdens the heart. There's a name for this in the science and policy literature, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, another mouthful, IBES, promotes the framework of nature's contributions to people to describe the various ways in which nature benefits human well-being. So these contributions are categorized into three main groups: the material contributions of food and materials, energy. Secondly, regulating contributions, so climate regulation, water purification, pollination. But then also the non-material contributions of education, recreation, and tourism, also cultural identity and spiritual practices and inspiration. So this is the nature contributions to people, NCP framework, but the question arises, can such frameworks really capture what is going on when a farmer or a scientist speaks of beauty or a gladdened heart? And I'd like to argue that that's where faith experience and literature can make sense of such feelings and point to a more fulsome experience of the world and a more fruitful vocation in the world that can be shared by us all. So Julian Evans, who I mentioned earlier, wrote this: I am reminded of C.S. Lewis's famous remark. He said of his faith, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. As a forest scientist, appreciating better the trees we find in the Bible's narrative has helped me appreciate better the Bible's far greater story. So his observance and study of trees enhances his understanding of the biblical truths taught with the help of trees, truths that are often about the design and purpose of the world and our place in it. Perhaps I could just give some examples of my own in that respect, starting off with the idea of the sprouting stump teaching us about mortality and hope. So trees can teach us about our mortality, and as we face that mortality or face a moment of devastation in our lives, it can teach us about hope. Of any part of the natural world around us, trees are those beings that most evidently outlive us. Some trees, like the olives in the Holy Land, for example, lived and still live for thousands of years. Many trees are renewed by coppicing and pollarding, brought low by suffering. Job in the Old Testament reflected on his mortality in comparison to the trees he was observing around him. He said, at least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its new shoots will not fail. Its roots may grow old in the ground, and its stump die in the soil, yet at the scent of water, it will bud and put forth shoots like a plant. But a man dies and is laid low. He breathes his last and is no more. But that longevity of trees, their ability to re-sprout and be renewed, can be a picture, illustration not just of our mortality in comparison, but also a picture of hope to hold on to. You probably remember the national outcry when the famous Sycamore Gap tree next to Hadrian Wall in Northumberland was felled by vandals one night. And then 10 months later, it was reported that 8 new shoots had emerged from the stump. And later on, there's 25 new shoots. And there was great excitement that the tree would live on in that iconic spot. Seeds and cuttings have also been taken, and the saplings are being planted in different communities as part of the National Trust's Trees of Hope initiative. They say, our hope is that it will enable more people to feel included in the story of the tree and to become part of its legacy, helping to create a new chapter in the life of this much-loved tree. In the Bible, the prophet Isaiah uses this picture, the sprouting stump, to describe how a remnant of the nation of Judah, following defeat by the Assyrians and exile to Babylon, would be renewed. And from that dynasty of King David, the Messiah Jesus was to grow as a shoot. So Isaiah chapter 6, verse 13. And though a tenth remains in the land, it will again be laid waste. But as the terebinth and oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. And then chapter 11, verse 1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. So a sense of mortality and a hope in an eternal life won by Messiah is expressed or illustrated by the life of a tree. Secondly, the mustard seed. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus told this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. So trees can also teach us about humility and wonder. Mighty oaks from little acorns grow, goes the proverb. And when we stop to think about it, it is a matter of wonder to see an oak tree growing from an acorn, despite everything we know about the scientific explanation for that. There has, of course, been a lot of conjecture about the choice of plant here in this illustration. So the mustard plant, as we know it, isn't a tree. Though it has been speculated that in the right conditions, it can grow with a branching form up to about 3.5 meters high. I don't know whether any keen growers in the room have approached anything similar to that. But perhaps the botanical identity has got lost in translation, but the principle holds and points to, I believe, a place of humility as we recognize that the growth of the tree, the growth of the kingdom of heaven is God's work and never ours. That the smallest things can ultimately become the greatest. And this is challenging in today's culture. As Tom Sine describes in his book, Mustard Seed versus Macworld, Reinventing Christian Life and Mission for a New Millennium, where he talks about in a world of economic globalization and big is best. He reminds that God's plan has always been to work through the small and insignificant to bring his new global order into being, led not from the boardroom of a transnational corporation, he writes, but by one who comes on a donkey's back. Thirdly, the stork nesting in a pine tree, teaching us about home and perhaps habitat. So from Psalm 104, the trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nests. The stork has its home in the pine trees. This, by the way, was when I was doing my PhD research. I was in southern Spain and operating a ground-based GPS reference station for an aerial survey that was taking place overhead. And I spent hours just basically sitting with this tripod and enjoying myself watching this fantastic umbrella pine tree with nesting storks and egrets in the distance. So that was wonderful. And I think this the sun and indeed that pine tree I was watching can teach us about habitat, and that is that there is a place for each creature on this earth in God's good design for it. The tree provides a most visual example of that, a place where a bird can nest and where an insect can be nurtured in a gall, and where a pollinator can find sustenance on the blossom at a critical period in life history. The native British oak tree is considered to contribute to the life cycle of over 2,000 different species, many of them invertebrates. In conservation terms, there sometimes runs the debate, should we share land with nature or should we spare land for it? In other words, try to make our farmland more habitable for other species by leaving the trees and rough field margins, or intensify and maximize production so that less area is needed and space, therefore, can be set aside elsewhere, spared for nature to thrive. Well, perhaps both are possible and needed in different ways, at different scales and in different places. But as a guiding principle on how we should seek to manage our land and seas on an increasingly populous planet, there's no better blueprint than Psalm 104. Sure, the pine tree and its stork's nest, but also running water for the donkeys, rain for the soil and its crop, grass for cattle, and mountains for goats and hyrax, daytime for man's endeavors, nighttime for the predators, all with a creator-ordained, proper and proximate place in this world. The natural world is to be shared by all species. And then finally, a tree planted by streams of water, teaching about rootedness. So from Psalm 1, that person, obeying God's law, is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Trees need the right conditions to thrive, some being more generalist than others, which need perhaps moist soils and climates. Contrary to popular perception, most tree biomass is actually quite shallow, concentrated in the top 50 centimeters of soil. Not all trees have deep taproots. A fruitful tree thriving in the right habitat is a picture of a human life well lived, a life that is rooted in community, discipline, patterns of godly living as well. This applies as much to alien species as one to its native habitat. Earlier this year, a study was published by researchers at Kew Gardens and University College London on giant redwoods growing in Britain. They far outnumber the 80,000 or so giant redwoods that are left in their native range in California. And terrestrial laser scanning methods used to create three-dimensional models of each one, shown in little diagrams at the bottom there, show that they are growing just as fast and well in this country as they are at home. The tallest is a mere 55 meters high compared to the 90 meters in California, but then again, they have a lot of catching up to do, as some of those Californian trees are 2,000 years old. But it's interesting that with climate change, it's considered that these trees here in the UK, these giant redwoods, have a less pressurized existence compared to in their native range. So the Reverend Dr. excuse me, Dave Bookless, who's the head of theology at Roche International, comments on God's words to his people in exile in Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 29. He writes, the people want to be somewhere else, but God calls them to put down roots in Babylon, to plant gardens and eat what they produce. So in other words, put down ecological roots, to have families, so social roots, and to pray and work for peace and prosperity of the city. So economic, political, and spiritual roots. It is a passage we need to recover for a world where global forces create millions of migrants and where rootlessness is epidemic, where, as Simon Weil says, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. So trees help us to understand truths about mortality and hope, wonder and habitat, rootedness. And there are, of course, other examples of things that we can learn about with the help of trees and how they're used for instruction and parable in the Bible. Might the increase of trees not just in areas of new woodland or urban streets and parks, but in our productive landscapes, where they have a place, a more obvious place in food production, but also in the whole functioning of those ecosystems? Might that be the means by which more people can connect to them in a meaningful way, connect better to matters of the heart and faith, as well as to practical matters of how we can be good stewards of the land? Every year for the last few years, there's been an agroforestry open weekend where tens of farms practicing agroforestry around the country, they open their farm gates to members of the public and farmers particularly, curious to see what this new movement is all about. And many such farms also involve local communities in the tree planting itself. The conservationist and tropical biologist Thomas Lovejoy, speaking about restoring trees as a response to the climate crisis at a meeting in Cambridge in 2019, addressed one joyful aspect of this when he said, quite wonderfully, it takes this challenge from being something that people say, well, what can I possibly do, to one where everybody can do things like plant trees or help restore wetlands and put some of that carbon back. To conclude, Oliver Rackham used to speak of the importance of seeing trees not simply as environment, but as scenery, not just as scenery in the theatre, but rather as actors in the play. As a historical ecologist, as he sought to understand the history and purposes of, say, an ancient orchard or a wood pasture or a terraced hillside, he would say, let us ask the trees. And as we approach our future, and think about our purpose, we can sometimes likewise do well to say, let us ask the trees. Thanks for listening.
I'll start with one online, as Sarah makes her choice. Colin is asking you to please comment on the economic feasibility and sustainability of various agroforestry methods. Are they dependent on grants, subsidies, and tax regimes? Another one, does the current extractive economics and food production system present an uphill struggle for long-term eco-sustainable methods rather than a level playing field? Did you catch all of that?
Yes.
Yeah. Feel free to look over my shoulder if it's helpful.
Might need to recap on that second one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, very good questions. I think on the economic case, I mean, it's that's a really interesting question, and I certainly know farmers who've been planting trees without the help of any grants or subsidies. As I mentioned, there are some now grants available for farmers, and so even more taking interest in that. But obviously, it is expensive. With the outlay of buying those trees, preparing the ground, protecting them with the tree guards, mulching them potentially. Sometimes you have to fence the field if the deer pressure is too great. So yeah, these costs stack up, and it's that initial funding in which I think is challenging. As I said, some farmers are managing to do that. I think those tend to be the visionary ones who perhaps have deeper pockets, who actually see the longer term benefits. I think otherwise it can be challenging. There are, as well as the sorts of grants I mentioned, there's the whole thing around the kind of carbon markets, around biodiversity markets. People have mixed feelings about that. I suppose I do too, but there's another way in which potentially there can be some upfront funding available. So it's economically feasible, certainly in the long term, but I think it's that first kind of stepping out on the journey, which can be quite challenging in that respect. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. That was really interesting. So I have a background in secondary school science, and sadly in biology, plant biology is the poor relation of the rest of biology, and it's always the case. Can you comment on that? Why do you think that might be?
Gosh, I almost feel like Cara should perhaps be answering that one rather than me, but yeah, no, I mean, I can sort of understand where you're coming from, and even when I was studying natural sciences here in the 80s, as I mentioned, you know, the part 2 botany class was actually quite tiny compared with zoology, which I suppose is a sort of similar point. And there's very little field plant biology, taxonomy, ecology taught. So, I mean, why that is the case, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm very quick to answer that. I mean, like animals more exciting in that they move, and I mean, is it as simple as that, or I don't know, but you know, I think trees, other aspects of plant biology are fantastic, and there's more and more, as I mentioned, all those popular books that are talking about those fantastic mycorrhizal fungal networks and so on. It is so exciting, and I guess the challenge is how do you kind of make that exciting to the children, which it should be. Yeah, I'm sure it can be. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. There's another one online which might follow on a little bit from that. Scientists and philosophers increasingly discuss the idea of intelligence or even mind in trees, plants, and non-human animals. From your perspective, what benefits might this view offer, and what limitations or potential problems could it raise?
Right. Really interesting question again. I mean, I think reminds me a little bit of Peter Vollenben, who I mentioned, who I think in his book, I mean, he's a forester. He knows what he's talking about, but he talks about how trees talk to each other. And I think some scientists have, in a sense, taken a little bit of exception to that kind of a language. I mean, I think he's defended that, and he really does believe that, you know, trees communicate through those underground networks or through the, you know, above ground dispersal of the as part chemicals. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure quite how to answer that in a little amount of time. And I think intelligence, in the way that perhaps we would, you know, think about that from my own perspective as human beings, is maybe not the same sort of intelligence that a tree or other plant would have, or a non-sentient animal. I mean, trees are incredibly, in a sense, intelligent in the way that they respond to their environment and adapt and everything else. But whether you can kind of use that kind of same sort of language of intelligence in the way that was posed by the question, I don't know. I'm not sure that it would be necessarily helpful. I mean, I don't know if anybody else in the room has any strong feelings on that. Do say so.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. At Marmalade Lane Co-housing in Orchard Park, North Cambridge, we've been trying to plant lots of trees in what is an ordinary urban block. And you can see the comparison between our block and the one next to it. And we've been trying to look after the two very old oak trees that are there and have had a lot of battering in their past. But it takes a lot of labor. And so I just wonder how realistic it is to get farmers to move into some agroforestry with the rest of their agricultural enterprises when there's such a shortage of labor, and labor is so expensive these days.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, really good points. And obviously there are mechanized ways of pruning trees or even harvesting the produce of trees, but no, it is more labor intensive for sure. I think, I mean, one could sort of say that this is actually, advantage of such a practice where you are bringing more people to work back into the countryside. There's been a sort of the modern technology has basically meant a lot of people have moved away from farming because you need fewer hands. But yeah, it is more labor intensive. I think a lot of farmers actually really think through this carefully in planning their agriculture. So they plant trees that they know that they will be able to manage within the context of their other farm operations. And that includes in a temporal sense. So making sure that if any tree management or harvesting is needed, then that would be happening when they're not at the same time needing to bring in the field crop or, do anything for that would be another demand on their time. So yeah, it does have to be carefully thought through. That the labor is an issue. I mean, it's obviously you're in a small urban project. It's all hands on deck, I guess. In a farm, necessarily there has to be the sort of efficiencies, and the mechanization comes into that. Agriculture isn't just around people managing trees using their hands. There's obviously a lot that can be done to mechanize it and make it more efficient.
Wonderful. We've got another one online. I'm not sure if you're a Tolkien fan, so how this will land. This person's asking, what are your thoughts on Tolkien's use of trees in his writing? Is that an okay question? You can say pass if you don't.
I think I'll have to. I was just saying to somebody yesterday evening, actually, was asking if I'd read Tolkien, and I think I haven't. Shocking.
Not a problem.
If you have a small garden and we wanted to plant one tree, what would be your top tip for the species of tree to plant?
Oh, I mean, you couldn't do much worse than apple tree. I think really well. I mean, the Peter Aspin in Shropshire, who I mentioned, he's amazing because he's experimenting with all sorts of trees, and every one that he pointed me to in his lines of trees, he would say, "Now this tree is going to be the most important one in the British landscape in years to come." And then he explained why he said that. So there's the monkey puzzle trees and maiden heathburn trees and things like that. So yeah, I think you can't, a fruit tree, I would say, because they can be really fantastic for the wildlife, but also giving you the joy of fruit that you're taking from it. Yeah.
If I could squeeze in one more question from online, and then we may be starting to run out. This person's asking, would you say that trees have an intrinsic value? A lot of what we've mentioned, forestry, the role of trees in parables, shows an instrumental or literary value of trees. So what about their intrinsic value?
Yeah, no, I do believe that. I mean, I think as a Christian, I sort of understand that the whole world has, in a sense, intrinsic value by being the God's creation. So absolutely, and you apply that to a tree as to every other aspect of the natural world he created. So yes, it really does have intrinsic value. Instrumental values, that they're the ones that really are, in a sense, emphasized in the kind of the policy science circles. But I think those major contributions to people are starting to actually recognize some of those non-material benefits, which perhaps is not the same thing as intrinsic either, because that's about benefiting human well-being too. But it's, I think, getting a little bit closer to the idea that trees have value in their own worth. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more? Yes, go for it.
I'm interested in worms as the healer for the planet, or one of the healers. And I'm wondering whether there's any research of what leaves they like best. Because they eat the leaves, and it wasn't for the worms, we'd all be wading around in piles of leaves. Sorry, did you hear that?
Well, you talk about earthworms. I missed the first few words, but I think
Has there been any research to discover which tree leaves the worms like best? Because they're really important in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's one of the things that we record in our monitoring of agroforestry is the populations of worms. And you can do a count on a square meter or whatever. So that's definitely relevant. I'm sure there is research. It's not research I've been part of. But yeah, I'm sure some leaves are more palatable to worms than others. Yeah, for sure, there's somebody looking at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Will, for today, and thank you for all your questions as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just thought I'd draw your attention to a few upcoming events that might be of interest if you were interested in trees. So in 2 weeks' time, we have Professor Janet Hoskis giving on next lunchtime a seminar on how to think about God, the Creator, today. And bookings are still open for our Caring for Creation course, which is aimed at church leaders looking to engage more deeply with this topic and thinking about how to lead the church forward in this. So if you want more information on that, it will be on the Faraday website.